Office 365, security and compliance, and all of those pieces that are there. A little bit about me, if you don't know who I am. I'm one of the speakers and one of the authors for courses at Skill Me Up. I run my own consulting firm. I've been around for a long time. I may not look like it in the picture, but I have been around for a long time, trust me. I'm also a Microsoft MVP and a Microsoft certified trainer as well, specifically in Microsoft 365 and security. And if you happen to be like me, I'm also a long-time runner. I like to run. I do lots of virtual runs right now as we all sit at home, so it's been quite exciting. So what are we going to talk about? Well, what I wanted to do was break Microsoft 365 down into its core kind of structures as far as protection capabilities go. So if we kind of break it down, we really focus it really in the beginning at the front door. So kind of identity. So how do we get into the system first? So we're going to talk about identity protection. Then we're going to focus on access control. So obviously restricting people coming in, as well as some controls that are available to us to kind of inspect that access. Then, of course, we move from the user down to the devices. So the actual device you're coming from, is it a cell phone? Is it a laptop? Is it an iPad or something else? And then, of course, we focus on the data itself. So the core data, so the documents, the files, things like that. And then lastly, we'll focus on some of the advanced security capabilities that are also available within Microsoft 365. So if we talk about the Microsoft 365 security architecture, I kind of broke it into those 4 blocks. So we have identity, access, devices, and information. Now, advanced security comes afterwards, so we'll focus on that later. So let's talk about identity first. So in the identity bucket, we kind of have some core capabilities that are available to us. The first one is conditional access. So that's utilized actually in quite a few of these buckets. But conditional access is the ability to control conditions of when something will happen. So when a user can log in, when a device can connect, etc. Then, of course, we have Azure Active Directory, which is the key authentication store behind the back of Microsoft 365. And so we have identity protection capabilities around user risk and sign-in activities. We then also have Azure Active Directory Privileged Access Management, which is really around controlling the admin accounts and granting just-in-time access, as it's called, to specific accounts that need to do administrative tasks. And then, of course, we have Azure B2B and Azure B2C, so business to business and business to commercial or consumer. So the ability for you to invite external people into your Azure Active Directory tenant. And I put that there as an option because it is a secondary identity framework. So out of the box, the most common design is to actually import accounts directly from on-premises Active Directory. And then once they're integrated in, they sync from the on-prem up to the cloud. But then, of course, with Azure B2B and Azure B2C, you're then bringing in people that don't have the domains, that they are external guests. And so that is also part of that identity, because the idea of moving to the cloud is that you want to bring other people in. For example, I've done a lot of work with SharePoint. I started life many, many years ago in pre-2001 versions of SharePoint, so alpha releases. And the whole idea of a platform that you could share things with would scare people. But now we're in the cloud all these years later, and so now it's become an important part of it, the ability to share and collaborate. When we talk about access kind of controls, then really our number one piece here is multi-factor authentication. I've been, I suppose, lucky and unlucky, I suppose, in being brought into clients of mine that have had security breaches within Office 365. Now, they haven't been hacked necessarily. They've just had compromised credentials. And in all of the instances that I've been involved in, if they'd had multi-factor authentication on all of the accounts, it probably would have stopped that process. And then, of course, as we come down a bit further from the device level, we have also Hello for Business, which obviously you may have utilized with facial recognition or specific keys that you're going to put into the devices and on the mobile devices to authenticate. Then, of course, when we talk about devices, we have a series of tools that are available. The first one being endpoint protection, which is effectively Microsoft Intune, as you probably will have known it as, which contains 2 core features. One is mobile device management, so the ability to completely configure and restrict and block a device. And then, of course, you have mobile application management, which is really catered for the bring your own device capability. So I bring my own cell phone. I want to get corporate email, but I don't want you to give me a device. I want to use my own. So how do we protect that? Then, of course, we can come to on-premises and we can connect System Center Configuration Manager from on-prem directly up to Office 365 to endpoint protection to allow us to utilize things like Windows Autopilot. So, we ship you a new Windows 10 device, you log in with your Office 365 login credential, and hey presto, it just configures itself magically using Office 365 and System Center. And then, of course, we have Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection, or ATP, which obviously runs on the Windows devices as Windows Defender, and of course, other platforms, like, for example, it'll be released for Mac and things like that. So the Windows Defender platform will obviously help us to protect the communication between the device and going into the cloud and other applications. And then, of course, when we talk about information, which really the first three are kind of just protecting at the door and the device, but the most important and critical thing that tends to come up is how do we protect the content? So we can utilize cloud app security, which we'll focus on in the advanced security capability bit. But really, we've got Azure information protection, data loss prevention, data governance, e-discovery for capabilities of finding, and then unified labeling. Now, I will state that unified labeling and AIP kind of go hand in hand, but they're both kind of separate right now, but they are merging into one. Data loss prevention for me is your protective ring fence around information. It's the one that just captures things that are there. So we have these four pillars. Now, realistically, if we look at the most common technologies that are being utilized, you basically end up with most organizations will end up based on licensing, and I know that's a separate conversation, end up with conditional access, some kind of multi-factor authentication, some kind of device management, so endpoint protection, predominantly data loss prevention, and sometimes cloud app security. Unified labeling and AIP is becoming more popular, but right now it's not the most common capabilities that's being utilized. So let's talk about identity and access protection then. So when we think of identity and access protection, we think of multi-factor authentication as the first option. Obviously, out of the box within Office 365, we utilize Azure multi-factor authentication, which can help safeguard access to the data and applications, and it's quite simple for the end users to use. It provides additional security by requiring the second or form of authentication, whether it's utilizing the mobile app or whether it's utilizing the text message or the phone. It doesn't really make a difference, one of those. And users may or may not be challenged for multi-factor based on the configuration decision that you implement as an administrator. Because if you're implementing multi-factor on a per user basis, they will have to go through the user registration. If they are utilizing conditional access policies, then it's normally based around some kind of risk validation. We then have, for example, passwordless. This is kind of a newer one that's been it's been in testing for a while, but the ability for you to do passwordless authentication via the Microsoft Authenticator app. Now, it does require your cell phone to have the app, but it means that there's no password required. You just need the PIN for the phone or a fingerprint, whatever it would be, or your facial recognition, depending on the device, and we can then allow users to authenticate. So two kind of second factor type capabilities. We then have risk monitoring. So risk monitoring provides custom recommendations to you about your security posture and the security posture of the users that are connecting into Microsoft 365. So we can do calculating of sign-in risk levels, user risk levels. You can be notified for those risk events. It allows you to investigate risk events using contextual information that's been retrieved. Also, there's basic workflows for tracking investigation, as well as remediation actions, for example, like a password reset or lock an account out, something like that. Then, of course, we have conditional access, and I like conditional access. This allows me to create policies to mitigate risky sign-ins. Now, you may wonder what a risky sign-in might be. So it could be something as simple as the end user comes in from a iOS device that's jailbroken. That would be a risky sign-in, even though the end user may not be a risky user. There may just be a regular user coming in because it met the criteria of the device. Then they obviously got restricted out. We could obviously define policies to block or secure those risky user accounts. For example, forcing multi-factor. You can also utilize conditional access to force everybody to go and register multi-factor as well, if we decide to utilize Azure Rights Management for that. Now, the multi-factor options are available to us. There are kind of two types. Well, I suppose there's three, because the third one would be third-party integration, because obviously Microsoft 365 does support that. There's cloud-only option, which is enabled on cloud accounts. Now, a cloud account would be one that you create in Azure Active Directory versus importing the account from on-premises, and you assign the multi-factor to the cloud account, and it's the easiest implementation possible. The other option is the hybrid one. So this requires Azure AD Connect. So this is where you're synchronizing on-premises accounts up to the cloud. The accounts are then enabled within Azure AD. And then if you wanted to, because we're utilizing this hybrid model, we could utilize ADFS or Active Directory Federated Services on-prem with multi-factor at that point, which means that you could then start to use second factor and device multi-factor as well. So ADFS supports that. So these kind of two core options that are available to us for multi-factor options. Now, of course, our next one in that protective barrier, after we'd obviously gone through the multi-factor process, is really around conditional access policies. So the idea behind the conditional access policies that we have us as the computer kind of connected in as a user. We have on-premises applications, we have cloud applications, and then, of course, we have the ability to block access as needed. So it's done by doing some validation against the types of properties coming in. So, for example, is the user a member of group A or B? If they are, then they can either gain access, or they get access to the cloud applications, or they get blocked. You know, is the cloud application allowed in the conditional access policy? Because we can limit that too. For example, we can have a cell phone device, and when the devices connect in, we can then say, is the device compliant? So that would mean, is it managed? Is it under Microsoft Intune, for example? Are we coming in from a geographic location that we've restricted and said, for example, that part of the world you are not allowed to connect in by? Then, of course, we have client application specifics. For example, if someone's trying to connect in with Microsoft Teams, maybe we don't want them to get access and we want to block access to that, or maybe they're trying to use Power Apps or something else. And then, of course, we do have the sign-in risk capabilities as well. So let's go and have a look at the capabilities available to us for identity and access protection. So I'm here within my tenant. You can see here, I'm just going to make this bit full screen. And what I'm able to do here is click into Azure Active Directory, which obviously is the authentication mechanism behind the tenant. Now, I am licensed for Azure AD Premium 2, so I am going to state that because some of these capabilities are only available in Azure AD Premium 1 and Premium 2, or they can also be available in the EMS type licensing. So I'm going to click Azure Active Directory, and then from here, I'm going to scroll right through to the security link that sits at the bottom underneath this first section called Manage. So when I click Security, on the left-hand side under Protect, you'll see three options, so Conditional Access and Identity Protection. And then at the bottom, we see the reports, risky users, risky sign-ins, and risk detections. If I click risky users, I don't have any details here, but if there was a user that was a risky sign-in, they would be listed here. If there was a sign-in from a user, so if I change the date to, the last month, for example, and click Apply, or if I go back and say Custom Interval, when we click onto here, you can scroll back through a series of dates. If I go all the way back, for example, it'll say, nope, you have to go back to 30 days. So just be aware that some of the data needs to be within a certain realm. So if I click Identity Protection, I get the user risk policy and the sign-in policy and the multi-factor registration policy that we just talked about. If I click user risk policy, from here, I can define what the assignment's going to be for this. So first off, I can designate whether these policies should apply to every single user. So I'm going to leave that as all users. And then maybe I want to exclude specific users out, which would be as simple as saying select excluded users. And then from here, you can pick the list of users or groups. I'm not going to exclude anything, but I'll just click back. I can then select the conditions. So the first thing is you set the risk. Now, you may be wondering what that risk might be. It's calculated on the fly, utilizing some of the telemetry information that Microsoft gets when you authenticate versus validating your account against a series of risks. So if I say medium and above, and then click Done, I can then go back and select the types of control that I need to apply. So as you can see, we either have block access, allow access, or require password change. So we can combine these policies to say, if somebody comes in and you identify it as a medium risk or a high risk, then maybe I'm going to say block access and then require a password change or allow. You'll notice that when you check the box, in order to require the password change, you do actually have to allow access in, because then you're forcing the password to be set. So let's say we do block access for now. I'm going to click select. And then at this point, I can then click enforce and do save. I'm not going to enforce it just because when you're doing a demo, it's not best to do it that includes all the users, which is why you would exclude administrator groups. Now, the same principle applies for sign-in risk. I'm just going to come away from that one. Same again, we can do a sign-in risk remediation policy. So again, we set the users and the conditions. When I go to conditions, you'll select the risk level again. So it's all around this risk intelligence. And then when I go to access control, you'll see we have the same thing, but this time it's going to say require multi-factor authentication. So we can then force an account based on a risk to have to validate against multi-factor. Our last one here is multi-factor registration policy, where what this one does, this will force the end users to go through and to require multi-factor registration. So the next time the end user tries to authenticate, you may have seen that screen where it pops up and says, hey, the administrator needs some more information about you. You can then go ahead and fill that detail in, and then you become registered for multi-factor at that point. So just 3 kind of easy options that are available to us. When the details are available, the reports will give you the information. So, if I say the last 90 days of risk detections, it would list all that information. But I'm in a clean vanilla tenant. So, of course, inside security also, we have conditional access policies. Now, out of the box, there are some default ones that are available. These will be going away. Microsoft has said that they'll be deprecated. So just be aware, if you're using those, you'll have to create new ones. But from a conditional access policy, we can then define, so I'm just going to call this one test 1. I can do the user assignment. So I can say all users, for example. It does tell you quickly you might lock yourself out. I can then choose either to specify cloud applications or specific user actions. But I'm going to say select applications, and then we get the list from Microsoft of all the applications. If I type Teams, let's pick Microsoft Teams, and I'll choose select. So this policy will now be ring-fenced to Microsoft Teams itself. I can then determine the conditions. I can do the risk, the device platform, for example. I can say configure this one and say this only applies to iOS devices that are coming in. And I can then determine locations and device state too. When I get to the grant option, now we get more capabilities. I can block or grant, and then I can choose what I'm expecting to happen for that access to be granted. So require multi-factor, require device to be compliant, make sure it's a hybrid joined device. So that means it's going to be a Windows device. Or I could also do require app protection policy. And what this will do is this will allow me to control what's allowed to be copied and pasted between the applications. Then I can say match all of the requirements, or I could say, just any one of them needs to be met. So let's say we do those 2. And then, of course, I can go to a session policy. What the session policy does, this is one that will limit the experience for the end user. So if you're on a Windows device, well, any device, in fact, and we put a session policy in place, we can then restrict what happens during that session. So, for example, I could say use a conditional app access policy. I can choose block downloads. And then that means when the end user logs into the web browser and tries to go to the SharePoint site and log in, they won't be able to download files during that session. And it will say it's monitored as well. So I could then create that policy. So a couple of different things available to us for identity and access protection, the ability for us to create risk and sign-in policies, as well as then control the flow of when an end user can actually connect into the system. Okay, so let's move on and we'll look at device protection. This one is a big area where for lots of people that I'm speaking to as clients, they want to know how to protect, especially at this time where we're kind of sitting at home quite a bit. We don't often know what the devices are that are being connected. So the first option is mobile device management. This is really structured around you define the devices and you provide them to the end users. So we can manage applications using MAM, and app protection policies on the devices that are enrolled in Intune. You can restrict the device configuration using policies. So this means I can turn off, for example, like an iOS device, I can turn off the gaming center, for example, or enforce restrictions like PIN controls. That one is particularly hard to support for bring your own device. Now, if we're using mobile application protection, which is also part of the device management capabilities, then MAM allows administrators to manage applications and policies on the devices, but not have to enroll the device in mobile device management. Because, I have a cell phone, it's mine, I don't want it connected to the corporate device, but I do like to get my email on it. So what we can do is we can manage the applications. So we can say this application and this application are under the protection of the company. And what that does is that creates an isolated encrypted container on the device where we can control as the organization what content can be moved backwards and forwards between those devices and those applications. We can also then restrict, cut, copy and paste. You can't copy a document from, for example, OneDrive for Business into another application such as Dropbox. So we have that flexibility utilizing the MAM components. This one is squarely designed for bring your own device, which is perfect. I have lots of devices. I don't know if you're like me, but I'm one of those geeky people. I'm actually sitting at my desk right now. I have two 34-inch curved monitors, a laptop I'm using, and I have two more laptops plus a desktop, an iPad, and two phones. So I have lots of devices, and I could be connecting to, for example, your environment on any one of those devices. And so you wouldn't know necessarily whether I'm opening up the OneDrive client and trying to sync the data to a device that you don't know about. So these two capabilities allow that flexibility. Now, in order for that to work, we need to understand device identity. So we have three core types of device registrations, or at least device identities. Azure AD registered. So the goal of an Azure AD registered device is to provide you with the support for the bring your own device. In this scenario, a user can access the Azure Active Directory controlled resources using a personal device, and it will be listed as a registered device, not one that you manage, but just one that's listed and you can see that. Now, there are some basic capabilities that you can provide also. Then, of course, we have Azure AD joined. So in this one, this is really around Windows deployments, your work-owned devices that you kind of own, and you get access to organizational apps and resources from those Windows devices. That's really where this is focused. You get cloud-based management for those devices as well, and then users can sign into their devices with their Azure AD or their Azure Active Directory on-prem synchronized accounts up into the cloud using the regular login. And then, of course, we have hybrid Azure AD joined. So if your environment has an on-premises AD, you also want the benefits of Azure Active Directory, you can join it to both of those domains. So it's a member of the on-prem AD and a member of the Azure AD. These are devices that are joined to both and registered directly into Azure Active Directory. So if you're using kind of Windows Autopilot, you can perform this kind of hybrid Azure AD joined. So how does this process work? So if we look at Azure AD device, so we have my BYOD device, and then we have my SharePoint device, and I will request access to the application from my BYOD device. I'm then getting an authentication request, which is as expected. And then during the authentication request, I'm then authenticated to Azure Active Directory, and then the device gets registered to that Azure Active Directory. So it's a simple process. The end user doesn't really have to be involved. It just happens as part of that authentication flow. And then they get access to the application based on, again, any of the policies that you define. So if we try this again with Azure AD joining, so we have a corporate device and then a SharePoint online site again. Same thing again, we request the application. We then go through and use the authentication request to the domain. We then perform an authentication and it joins us to Azure Active Directory. Once it's been joined, then of course, we then get application access granted to me. So just a different approach. That's a corporate device like a Windows Surface laptop or something else. Then of course, the hybrid Azure AD join is a little bit different. So we have the corporate device, so Windows 10. And then, of course, at this point, we are domain joined to Active Directory, which is also then connected to Azure AD Connect at this point. Azure AD Connect is then in control of the adding to Azure Active Directory as a registered device. So 3 different flows. It almost looks very similar. The only difference for the Azure AD one is that you're obviously relying on Azure AD Connect to push and synchronize up where needed. Now, of course, on top of being able to set the device identity, then we also have the ability to do device compliance policies at this point. So, for example, we have Microsoft Intune, Azure AD, and conditional access policies. So Intune uses the conditional access policies to enforce the compliance. So when a device enrolls directly into Microsoft Intune, the Azure AD registration process kicks in, which we just talked about, and the device information is then updated directly into Azure AD. One key piece of the information is the device compliance status. The compliance status is then used by conditional access policies to block or allow access to any of the applications or services or organizational resources that you wish to use. So if you're utilizing conditional access policies, then obviously for devices that comply to the policy rules, you can give them access to email, etc. If the devices don't comply, then you block them from those applications. Now, if we're not using conditional access, then we can actually use device compliance policies, which are defined in endpoint protection. And so when you use the compliance policies independently, each device is targeted and evaluated, and then their compliance status is reported back to endpoint protection. Okay, so let's go and have a look at endpoint protection. Okay, so I'm going to come out of Active Directory and I'm going to click on Endpoint Manager, which is here in the Admin Center. Now, of course, it used to say Intune, but it's now Endpoint Manager. So what we have here is Microsoft Endpoint Manager Admin Center. You'll see that if I click on Devices, if I have devices registered, I can click All Devices and they will be listed as devices listed here. I could also then filter out by platform. And when I click on iOS, you can see that I have iOS devices and I have iOS enrollment. Now, iOS devices will give me a list of the devices that have already been registered to the network. And of course, if I was connecting in a device now, I could open up my iOS phone. I could then log in with my credential, let's say, to the OneDrive client. And as part of that process, it would appear listed here. We also have iOS enrollment. Now, this is a little bit different. This is where you're going to be creating MDM capabilities. You'll need to create an Apple MDM push certificate first, and then you can then go through the Apple configuration. If you're doing Google devices, Android devices, or Windows or something else, you'll have to repeat that same process. Now, what we have is compliance policies. Now, of course, these are different to conditional access policies. So the compliance policy, I have one here called Contoso MDM Compliance Policy for iOS. If I click into this, it gives me a breakdown of obviously what's in there. I can get the device status, etc. But if I click Properties, this will break down what's inside that policy. So you can see I have sections for basic, compliance status, actions for non-compliance, scopes, and assignments. So I can click Edit in each of the sections. So firstly, this will be the basic. So the name, you specify the platform and the profile, and then we save. So I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll go here and we'll say Create Policy. You first select what it's going to be. Now it's defaulted to iOS and iPad because I've filtered it out to iOS devices. And then it says we're going to create compliance policy. I'm going to click Create. And then we get this wizard process that we can go through. So I'm going to call this Compliance Policy Demo. I'm going to give it the same name. You'll see it's pre-populated those values for us. If I click Next, then of course you can see the categories we have available to us. If I click Email, the first thing it will say is Email, unable to set up email on the device. And so if you want to know what they are, if you click on the eyes, it'll say a managed email account is required. Now what that means is that when the user goes in, they have to go in and register, and it will create an email profile, which is managed by Office 365. So I can say require. I can then go to device health, and I can say I want to block a jailbroken phone. And then also I have require the device to be at a specific threat level. So if we go back to the eye again, it'll say select the maximum allowed threat level. So I'm going to say medium. So if it's anything above a medium, then it's not going to pass and it will just block it out. I can then specify minimum versions or maximum versions of the OS, which I'll just leave as is. And then in the system security, if I scroll a bit further down, you can see that we have the enrollment types that are available to us. So I want to allow a device to require a password. Now, for example, with my previous employer a few years ago, whenever we would connect and want to use our bring your own device to get email, you would have to agree to the fact that there would be a specific password. And of course, the downside to it was a little bit frustrating because I had a PIN code already, but as soon as I registered the phone, it made me create a new one. And then every 90 days, it would then ask me to change it again and again and again. So I can say block simple passwords. I can say we want to make that, I want 8 characters and the password type alphanumeric just to make it really complicated. I want the number of alphanumeric has to be at least 4. And then the minutes after the screen lock before the password is required. So let's make it 15 minutes. Maximum number of inactive until the inactivity until it locks. So let's do 3 minutes. You'll see we've got 41 is the default one. This is a Microsoft default, really based around giving the ability to rotate the password every 40 days, but it gives you an extra day to go with it. But I'm going to say let's do 90 days. And then, of course, the number of passwords, previous passwords to prevent, I'm going to make it really hard and say just 10. Like that would be the most horrible policy to create. I'll do next. Then at this point, we can then say, well, specify the sequence of actions. So if the device is kind of non-compliant, then what we can do, we could say send an email to the user, and then you can select a template for that email. And if there's a template listed here, then we can say this is the template I wish to utilize. We can then also say additional recipients should get that email as well. I'm not going to do that. But it means I can say, well, if it's non-compliant, then do this. Or I could say remotely lock the device and then retire the non-compliant device. So we can build a set of actions that take place if that device is then non-compliant. So I'm going to delete that one and we'll just say remotely lock. Choose next. I can then do scope tags. Scope tags are the ability for you to kind of categorize things across the board. What's more important here is that I can select the groups or the users. So I can say select groups to include. I'm going to go here. I'll pick my engineering group, click select, and then select the groups to exclude. Maybe I'm going to scroll down and say security group users, for example. So self-service password reset group, and I'll click next. So there's my new policy. So I can simply apply that policy, click create, and at that point, when the devices try and connect, we then have those compliance policies. Now, if I go to endpoint security here on the left-hand side, you'll see that we get security baselines, but notice what appears here is conditional access. If I click conditional access, this will take us back to here, but the left menu stays the same. So this is where I can create a new policy, and then from here, I can go through that same process utilizing conditional access for device management. Now, inside endpoint security, of course, if we are utilizing Windows devices or others, we can also do any of these, so endpoint detection and response. We can also do attack surface reduction. So if I click create policy here and select Windows 10, choose a policy, I can say I want to apply web protection. Click create. That will then go and create me a new web protection policy, which if we look through the options here, you can see enable network protection. I want that enabled. I want smart screen on, block malicious, and block unverified downloads. And then we can go through and scope and assign as we did before. So endpoint protection allows us to create policies that we can apply, not just to bring your own devices, but also devices that we may have added ourselves into the tenant as far as deploying those. If we click into security baselines, you can see we have some basic ones that are here. So for example, the edge baseline, if we click into that, you can see that we can create a profile for that one. If I do baseline edge, you'll get sent through the same thing again. So a wizard, if we choose next, then it gives me all of the configuration for Microsoft Edge. So turning off Flash, to controlling extensions, etc. So the goal with endpoint protection is to completely control where possible and at least limit what can happen to a device and what the device can do. Okay, so now let's move on to our next pillar, which is information protection, which for me is one of the biggest pillars. that has capabilities available to us. So within information protection, we're going to talk about data loss prevention, unified labeling, and then, of course, rights management. So data loss prevention is going to help you identify sensitive information across many of the locations in Microsoft 365. So Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, OneDrive for Business, Microsoft Teams. The goal is to prevent accidental sharing of sensitive information, and I like to change that because it can also prevent malicious sharing of sensitive information as well. So the goal here is to monitor and protect the sensitive information, not just in the cloud and what's moving around. It's also available inside the desktop clients. So what actually happens here is any policies that we define can be synchronized down to the Office applications and then run in real time inside those applications. Unified labeling is the new process. This is why we're not talking specifically around Azure Information Protection. Azure Information Protection is an Azure service that's bolted in as licensing and connected to Microsoft 365. What this does, this allows me to apply a classification to a file with a policy that it will then float around. Wherever that file moves, it has that specific policy. So unified labeling is the new version of that. And obviously you'll be going through, or Microsoft will be going through a migration from Azure Information Protection. Now the logic here is quite simple. Right now, without unified labeling, you would have to designate people who have access to the Azure tenant to go and manage Azure Information Protection. Whereas Microsoft want you to stick inside the security and compliance capabilities within Microsoft 365 to do the same. So labels apply a classification to the documents and emails, and then you can apply an optional protection. Now, what's interesting is that the protection actually comes from rights management. So rights management, or what's called Azure RMS, is a cloud-based protection service, which is the cloud version of rights management services that's part of the Windows Server. And this allows you to create authorization policies that can work across any type of device. It'll protect whether it's inside or outside of the organization. And then the protection remains with the data, even when someone, for example, puts a USB drive in the machine and takes that content with it. So label classification can be applied to documents and emails. The key is here that labels can include visual markings and headers, footers, or watermarks also. Metadata is then added to files and email headers in clear text. So you get this balance of a document and then metadata wrapped around it, which then is the protected document at that point. Now, data protection is obviously a little bit more detailed. So the protection comes from Azure Rights Management. It uses encryption, identity, and authorization policies, so a little bit more controlled than just a label. The protection is applied with the rights management will then stay with the document, and the email's independent of that. So when you actually go in and have a look at it, which we'll do in a second, you get to define both sets of this for the specific content. So let's go and have a look at the information protection capabilities. So let me go back to my tenant here. So I'm going to come out of my endpoint protection and we'll click compliance. Now, obviously, depending on whether you're in the new modern UI or in the old one, the links will either go to the new or the old. So if we go to this one, I actually went to the compliance link and it took me to this one here. Now, for example, if I wanted to have a look at data loss prevention, if I click policies here on the left-hand side, you can see I have the flexibility of creating a policy. Now, before we do that, I want to expand classification and click on sensitive info types. Now, sensitive information types are the classification of the content. So, for example, if I just scroll down all the way to the bottom here and click US Social Security number, you can see that this is a inbuilt sensitive information type. If I click test the type, I can, for example, drag a document into here and then test if it matches that specific one. So we have a list of them. So US, UK, Thai, Sweden, all different types of countries. Now, the reason I show you that is because this is kind of an underlying piece that lets you build data loss prevention policies or sensitive or retention labels. So if we go to a DLP policy here and say create policy, you'll notice we get presented with those sensitive information types. So let's say I want to do privacy and I'm going to pick the US, I can then say I'm looking for US financial data. Now you'll see the combination of the sensitive info types listed here. So whenever we do US financial data, it's looking for credit card numbers, bank numbers, and ABA routing numbers. So I'm going to click next. It's going to give me a name. I'm going to click next here. Then I get to choose the specific locations. So out of the box, it'll do Exchange, SharePoint Sites, OneDrive, Teams, Chats, and Messages. And then you can filter out by either all of it or choose specific locations. I'll just leave it as all. And then I can say, find this content that has these information types in there. And then I want to detect it when it's trying to be shared outside the organization or inside. I could also click Advanced Settings and click Next, which I'm not going to go through here, but this lets me kind of more granular control how it's identifying the content. But if we just choose the first one, you can see I can then show policy tips to the end users. And once I've created those, I can then go through and determine, detect when the content's being shared, at least so many instances, etc. as you go through. Then underneath that, I can then say send an incident report, or I could say restrict and access, encrypt the data. Now, of course, if it's just blocking access, I can then restrict from being shared. If it's encrypting, then of course it only applies to emails. So as a separate one, there was a question which says, can you create policies for US government and export the compliance info? So you can create any of these policies and you can then export them out. You have to use PowerShell to get them out. They are structured in an XML definition, and then you can reutilize those again. You can also create all of these policies utilizing PowerShell, which for me is the preferred mechanism if you're going to be reutilizing them in other locations as well. So if I click next, I can then choose the protection settings I wish to apply. And what you'll see listed here is the actual list of labels that are available. And I can then say, this is part of Project Falcon and it's highly confidential. So click next. And then what will happen is going to moan because it says this is email and I was using something else because I'm using documents. You have to specify Exchange as the location, but I can click next and then go through and save. But if I just do highly confidential, choose next. Oh, I still have others in here, so confidential. And then I can do next, and then I can apply that. So when one's been created, if we look at my US financial one, we can come back in at any point and choose edit the policy. You can go to the locations, you can do the policy settings, and you can modify. You can also add new rules and go through the advanced capabilities to utilize that too. Now, the DLP policies, as you mentioned, utilize sensitive information types. So that means I can come into classification and create sensitivity labels, which will be, when this loads, those list of fields that we just saw, those policies are listed here. So I could create a label. I'm going to call it test label, and we'll just populate that with the same values here. Choose next. I can then specify the encryption and say apply, and I can apply permissions now, which means I'm going to say on a number of days after this has been done, so let's say 3 days, I'm going to do that, and I'm never going to allow offline access. Then I can assign permissions, and you'll see it's an interesting way that it kind of flows, that you can either pick, all users and groups, which will be the permissions, or I could say add users or groups, which will give me a list. So I can say Adele and Alex and Alan, all of my A's, add them in, choose permissions, and I can pick predetermined permissions here, or I can say custom. So I could say they can view, they can save, but they can't do anything else. So I'm going to click save. You'll see my rights are assigned. Click OK, and that becomes my permissions that are assigned to that encryption protection. I can then define content markings. So I can put a watermark into the document and just say, let's say I type the word private. I'm going to make it red. This is then going to apply in diagonal across that Word document or document that it finds. I can then do auto labeling, and I can say apply this label automatically. Now you will need the E5 licensing to do automatic, or at least the Azure AD Premium AIP licensing P2. So I can say recommend that users use it, or I can say automatically apply, and I can add a condition where something contains whatever to be the reason for doing it. I'm not going to do that one for now. Click next, and then I can submit that, and that's my new sensitive label that gets created. Once the label has been created, It'll then be listed here. I then turn around and create a policy. So I'm going to say, I want to create a new policy. Oh, I need to choose the label first here, which is test label. Click add, do next. Choose who I need that to be associated to. So I can do add. And let's say we choose my Adele, my A's again. Click done, choose next. Then I can apply like this label to documents and require the users to apply it. Click next. Then I'm going to say whatever the policy is going to be. So I'm going to call this test policy, choose next, and then submit. And that creates my policy. So now I have a label and a policy that is now available to the end users. Now, of course, the way this gets surfaced to the end user is it's done via the Office client or in the web browser. If you're in SharePoint or OneDrive, it appears as a field that you can list. Or if you're in the Office application, you can deploy the toolbar and then you can utilize these capabilities. Now, of course, if I just go back to Azure Active Directory, we'll just load this here. And then actually, I'm going to change my URL to portal.azure.com. So I've now gone to the root tenant, which will be Azure AD Basic, not a full-blown tenant. And I can then go in and say information. There we go. And you'll see Azure Information Protection comes up. And this is the full-blown administration console for it. And so what you can see from here is there's my test label that I created. So my test label here is listed, and I can then go through and customize it here. Any changes that I make here are reflected here and vice versa. So you can see there's a kind of a flow there between the two. But this allows me to create those policies to classify content at the content level, and then the DLP policies then be associated to content as it tries to leave the organization. Okay, so let's go to advanced security. So our last kind of area to focus on. So my advanced security capabilities are really focused on three areas: threat detection, enhanced control, and then discovery and insights. So within the threat detection, we can set up anomaly detection policies. So behind the tenant, there is a behavioral analysis and anomaly detection platform that is looking for things that are unusual. So for example, if you come to work every day, open up your email and send emails and work on spreadsheets, the behavioral analysis platform will understand that that's what your normal daily tasks and work are. Outside of that, if you do something different, it will then flag that. So you can be alerted to potential breaches of your network. It tries to identify a potential breach. It will scan user activities and then evaluate them against risk indicators. And there are plenty of those that it goes against. And then, of course, you can leverage behavioral analytics to assess the risky user behavior. And this does this all out of the box. For enhanced control, we can set up activity policies that can track both user and admin specific activities. We can then review the alert and perform investigations for those activities. And then, of course, we can configure activity policies to perform some kind of governance or remediation. So, for example, suspending an account, disabling an account, forcing a password reset, etc. And then, of course, what's nice is that we get discovery and insight. So we can review the app discovery dashboard to identify those risky kind of applications that are connecting. We can identify and import security and proxy logs, for example, on premises. So let's say you're utilizing a Cisco firewall on-prem. You can take those logs and import them up into advanced capability and then utilize those. And we can also then control application usage. Okay, so let's go and have a look at the advanced capabilities. So I'm going to close this one down and this one down, and then I'm going to click on security, which will probably take me back to the protection center. And from here, I'm going to expand onto alerts. We're not going to focus on alerts. I'm just going to click managed advanced alerts, which will then give me a link to Cloud App Security. Now, the link to this one is portal.cloudappsecurity.com. And then outside of that, it'll then redirect to the name of the domain that you have for the tenant. So you do need to be licensed for Cloud App Security, even though it just works. You will need to have a specific license, whether it's EMS licensing on top of the regular E5 or E3 licensing, and there are different levels of things that will work versus the license that you have. Now, the first thing to look at here is alerts. So I have some alerts listed here. I have, for example, my administrator account has activity from infrequent country. So what that means is you can see that my account suddenly logged in. It's come in. These are the login events. It came in from the US over that specific IP address. If I click onto that login activity, it expands and gives me more details of the type of device, where they were coming in from. Of course, what app was coming in. And you'll see we have these little kind of icons we can click on. So I can say view activity for the same type. So this will then go and filter my audit event, my audit logs, looking for activities that match there. I could also do the same for activities by that same user, by IP address, by geolocation, or also by specific time frame. We also then have obviously details about the device, which I can click into, or I can go to the right here and choose the actions menu, and then I can choose what I want to do. So I can say view all user activity, and it's going to pop my block up here. So I'm just going to say allow, and we'll do that again. View all user activity will then launch a new window, and it will look for that same account and look for everything that's been assigned. So you can see my tenant that I'm logged in, and I previewed some files. I changed the user license for some accounts utilizing PowerShell. I can click on that one, and it will give me a breakdown and say, okay, so the user that did this action is an administrator. It was internal. You can see the types of activities over the series of days. And then, of course, as before, I can then choose the drop down and determine what to do. Now, if I go to another one, you'll see there's 4 actions, but if I go to this one, there's only 2 actions. So they are contextual based on the type of activity that's taking place. Now, if I go to investigate and click activity log, this gives me every type of activity. So for example, I've got some PowerShell ones, I've got some Search Data Insight ones, I've got SharePoint Access. If I go to the SharePoint Access one, it gives me 4. If I go here, I get 4. So depending on what the activity is will determine the actions that can happen. Now, all of these are controlled by policies. So I have a series of policies. These are out of the box, but I could also create a new policy. And I could say, I would like to create a file policy. So in this instance, this is where we're encroaching on data loss prevention. So I can go in and say, I'm looking for PII data that's been detected in the cloud. So I'm going to apply the template, and it will fill everything out for me. It'll define the category. And if we go down here, you'll notice that it gives me the drop down of effectively the sensitive information types that we just used for the other component for doing Azure Information Protection and Unified Labeling. So I'm looking for Social Security. What I can then do is scroll all the way down here, and I can then say, create me an alert. I can actually go back and go through and send an alert as an email. I can then send it as a text message, or I can say I would like to go and utilize a playbook. So I created a playbook here inside Power Automate, so Power Apps and Power Flow, Power Automate even, so Microsoft Flow. And so I can then send it off to that and cause an action. What I can also do, though, is if we just expand these 2 sections, I have capabilities for governance actions, where I can go through and say, make this private, or put it in the trash, or remove somebody off it, or apply a classification. And you can see that those labels are now surfaced directly here. So I'm going to say, make it confidential because it's finance. Or I could say, apply it because it's in SharePoint. So put it as Project Falcon, for example. Or I could say, put the user in quarantine, or remove an external user, etc. So I can add these types of capabilities into these types of policies. Now, if I'm just going to cancel that one, that was a DLP one. I can also do this for types of activities. So I can go through and say, we have a list here of the default ones. So somebody added an external user to Teams, or someone was mass deleting things from within Microsoft Teams. So this gets predetermined. You can see we can modify here how that happens. We can say I'm looking for it in a single app. I'm looking for kind of 50 activities that have been repeated. And then when we expand, you'll notice that my governance options are different. So every type of activity policy that we can create, or file policy, has different activities that are available to us from the action side. Now, of course, we also can go into the Discover, and I'm going to click Cloud Discovery, because the purpose of Cloud App Discovery and Cloud App Security is to actually go through and look for applications that are inside the tenant. So if applications have been connected, if I go to Cloud App Catalog for a second, you can see the list of applications. And of course, there's a whole list of them. There's about 16 to 18,000 of them, I think is the number. And so what we can do is we can look at the applications and say, oh, you know, the MS Invoice application has been given a score of 10. If I change that the other way around, you'll see that there are some applications that have no score. So this is where that risk kind of comes in when it's validating. This application, as in Cloud App Security, if I just click on the dashboard, is squarely created so that you can ring fence things that are being connected to Office 365. So for example, a common use case is somebody has Dropbox, you connect Dropbox to an Office 365 application, then of course you can get that surfaced here. And with the policies that you create, you can then control how the data flows between the two applications. So of course you can see it's got specific ones around the applications. If I click Microsoft Teams, it'll give me the alerts. If I click Office 365, it gives me the alerts. If I do Cloud Discovery, it'll give me one and say Cloud Discovery Anomaly. I can click onto it and then it will give me the list of anything that's found in here. So from an alert perspective, this can capture any kind of activities as long as your application is connected into Azure and connected to Azure AD as far as the authentication would go, then it will capture that information. Now, of course, if we take this last one here, where it says Tor IP address, this is somebody trying to come in anonymously, and you can see here that they were failed to sign into Tor. This was the IP address. This was the ISP. They failed to log in. We can see the details. It tells me it was Tor. And then from here, I can view other details to make sure that it's not an account compromise. So I could say view activity of the same type. And of course, it's going to go back and try and look for multiple attempts that came in. And sure enough, there's lots of these failed attempts, but not all of them are related to the Tor network. But it lets you build a picture so that then you can do an investigation. Now, of course, our last piece here would be if we go to the settings here. Inside the settings, we have the ability to connect and do automatic uploads of logs. So for example, I have a data source and then I can have a log connector. So if I click add data source here, I'm just going to call it test. What I can do is select the data, which would be something on premises. So let's choose Cisco ASA firewall. And then I can say, please send it using, let's do syslog over TCP. I can click add. That gives me my syslog. I now need to configure that. And my log connector is an application that you install to be able to say, I want to do that. And so from the data source, I click the test. I then give it my IP address, let's say, which is clearly not going to be 1.1. And then I can say Cisco ASA. And then I can click update and close. And that will then, I'm not going to create that because it'll try to connect and then it'll cause me errors. But what it will do is it will try to receive that information. And then in the alerts, and in the activity log, if we go to this one, you'll actually start to see on-premises information being streamed into the activity log. So from an advanced capability, you get integration here. If we go back to settings, you can see if we scroll down here, you've got Azure Advanced Threat Protection, which can be integrated directly into it. So which means it's going to look at some of the security capabilities from on-premises. Azure Information Protection can also be bolted in. And then, of course, you've got Azure security capabilities that come from the Security Center. So the most important thing around Microsoft 365 and these capabilities is that you're utilizing Microsoft 365 capabilities that are built in and available to you in the admin centers. You're utilizing everything that would come if I click in Azure Active Directory. You're utilizing components here, and then you're also using pieces directly inside Azure Tenant, such as Azure Sentinel. So you can take this information, export it out to Azure Sentinel, and then be able to monitor what's going on. Okay. So in summary, we talked about Microsoft 365 security capabilities. We started by talking about identity protection and focusing on those capabilities that are available in Azure AD. Then we talked about access protection by talking about conditional access policies, as well as those other components we can control for access. Then, of course, we focused on device protection. So the ability to control the device by looking at endpoint security and capabilities. And then we looked at DLP and labeling capabilities within Azure Information Protection and Unified Labeling. And then lastly, we looked at the advanced security capabilities from Cloud App Security. So thank you for attending. I'll just look at the questions. Obviously, we already talked about create the policies for exporting. That's done. I highly recommend that you create them using PowerShell. It's easier to kind of repurpose those as needed. Next question, if you want to migrate the application, a custom one, a 365 solution, can you limit access to certain pages or controls? Yes, you can. Depends how you're building the application. You can do that either permissions based, or if this is a custom kind of